Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this afternoon session. Is this actually amplifying my voice? No, it's not.
But does it make you feel good?
It's fantastic. Would you like a try? So I'm Mark Harris from the University of Edinburgh. It's a real privilege to welcome our first keynote speaker, Dr. Celia Deane-Drummond, who is at the University of Oxford. And I should say also she's our Vice President for SRF as well. So really, really glad to have her as our first keynote speaker. She's currently Director of the Laudato Si Research Institute and Senior Research Fellow at Campion Hall at Oxford. Her work is at the interface of theology, ethics, and the biological and human sciences, and she has a very long career before her career as a theologian in biology. So one of these very, very impressive people who has published work, much published work in both sciences and in theology. And I just want to highlight two of her recent books, a 2-volume piece on the evolution of wisdom. Anyway, Celia, please come and speak to us on the topic of We See in a Glass Darkly, exploring the hermeneutics of virtue and vice beyond the species boundary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that generous welcome, and it's a real privilege to be here, and I would like to thank Finlay Lawson as well and the Science and Religion Forum Committee for inviting me to this, to give you a talk this afternoon. And I'd have to say that I'm really delighted that the whole topic of this conference is the one it is. It's something I've been interested in for a number of years, and so it's a real joy to see you sort of, us really, exploring this in the next few days. So the historical debate between Darwin and Wallace included the puzzle of morality. And the tendency even then was to believe that we have a kind of brutish nature which leads to sort of negative or even violent and perhaps even selfish tendencies. But why we became moral is much more difficult to understand. And how did it evolve? Charles Darwin himself spoke of it as a knotty problem, of which the difficulties, as he said, caused me much labour. So he didn't really know really how to explain it. And the question for evolutionary biologists is, it has to make sense in evolutionary terms. They're not just going to give up because it's difficult. We have to sort of struggle and think, where has it happened? Why has it happened? How is it that moral agency has arisen at all? But before we get to that question, we might want to think about what does a moral agent mean? What does it mean to say we are moral agents? Immanuel Kant thought that the unique capacity for moral reasoning, abstract moral reasoning, was what morality is all about. And if you define morality like that, then it rules out automatically the connection with other beings. Frans de Waal, on the other hand, rejects that there's somehow a moral layer on top of a kind of brutish nature, what he calls the veneer hypothesis, and says that rather morality should be thought of as a choice according to social norms. And if we define morality as choices according to social norms, then the boundary between humans and other animals starts to become much more blurred. But there are consequences to this as well, which we might want to think about, and also another reason why I got interested in it is that if morality is simply accountable by an evolutionary story, then what about the normative claims? Could they be upheld? And most evolutionary biologists will say that morality is a useful fiction. That's certainly many of those who are working in this area have described it as that, Michael Roos being one of them, who's a historian. And it's a fiction in order to allow different species to cooperate with one another in larger groups. So in order to solve the difficulties of cooperation in a large group, morality has evolved. So that's sort of broadly the explanation. So how would you control free riders? Well, free riders are those who take advantage of the goods that are in a particular community. And in order to control the free riders, morality has evolved. At the same time, there are problems with this particular explanation. It tends to debunk the moral truth of morality at all, and many philosophers will therefore object to that thesis. So we're left with a conundrum. On the one hand, we want to start thinking about morality in evolutionary terms. And on the other hand, when we start to think about it in evolutionary terms, it seems to cut out the very heart or the very issue of what morality seems to be about. And I'd have to say that evolutionary biologists will also do the same with religion as well. So in other words, there's a way of thinking about religion in evolutionary terms that tends to debunk its claim for particular normative truths. So we're arriving at then, if you like, a tension between evolutionary explanations and other explanations. And I think we need to face those tensions and start thinking about it in creative and different ways. And we have to also think, is there necessarily a direct evolutionary line from other animals to humans? We need to consider the theory of mind and also the cognitive complexity in evolutionary terms. Kant was one extreme end who thought that morality required a particular kind of thinking, abstract reasoning, but then there's also other ways of thinking morality. So how can we sort of sort through this kind of mess? My own particular view is that the definition of morality may differ, but at the same time we can't assume that there's no relationship at all between evolutionary explanations of moral agency in other animals and ourselves and humans. So in other words, there is a distinction, but it's not necessarily a complete separation. Sarah Coakley, in a well-known series of articles, argued that altruism and extreme forms of altruism was very different from empathy, and the two could not be compared. My own view is that this is more mediatory. That is, we can't completely split them apart, but at the same time, we need to recognize the distinctions. In all these debates, it seems to be assumed that there is a single isolated valuer in a single encounter with another. And I prefer to argue for a multi-species approach. That is, the context in which our morality evolved was in a multi-species one. So that what was valued within other species communities may differ from our own, but it was worked out in the context of those multi-species relationships. So our interests, human interests, may be distinct from those of other creatures, but throughout human history, until relatively recently, we were living in multi-species communities. Things like justice, compassion, or practical wisdom that we're familiar with in the human moral sphere, in evolutionary terms, becomes translated into inequity aversion for justice, other regard for compassion, and a symbolic thinking for practical wisdom. And the field itself is enormous. So when I started thinking about this, I thought that it didn't make sense to talk about morality as an enormously broad bucket in which all moral aspects were collected. Rather, we needed to think about these individual tendencies. And again, these are just 3 examples: justice, compassion, and practical wisdom. And I'm going to narrow down the focus today even further and just talk about justice, as well as a tendency for something negative, and that is deception and lying. because we must get away from any tendency to be romanticizing about other creatures. And so in order to do that, I want to look at the relationship between deception and lying. And really there's a dynamic relationship between virtue and vices, and that's also in dynamic relationship with that in other beings as well. So let's sort of be a little bit more specific then and look at inequity, aversion, and fairness and the relationship between them. Primatologists generally don't talk about fairness, or they may, as we'll come on to that in a minute. They're much more likely to use the language of inequity aversion, and it means a reaction to unequal distribution of goods. And the impunity game has been tried on human subjects, and in this case, money is given to a proposer who splits it with a responder who knows how much money that proposer was given. Now, if the proposer offers the responder less than half the money, in other words, if there's not an even share between them, the responder will regularly refuse to accept, even though they're going to get nothing. So rather than take an unfair share, they'll say, no, I don't want anything. So nothing is gained. And what's interesting is this impunity game, as it's called, is very similar in other species when it's tried in other species. If you, in these particular experiments, a pair of monkeys can see the other partner, and there's a task that's required, and that task seems to reinforce the fact that these relationships are social in nature. And in order to understand this, what I mean a little bit more clearly, I'm going to show a very short clip from Frans de Waal's TED Talks that he did a number of years ago, and I was hoping that most of you at least won't have seen it already, but it illustrates the point. And I'm going to get some technical help. This is prepared in advance. Thank you very much.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study.
This is Frans de Waal.
Yeah, a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. With Sarah Boston, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but the cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now if you give the barley grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so, if you give them grapes, so there's far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and it turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece he eats. Then he sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here. So, so a final experiment that I want to mention to you.
Oh, get rid of it.
And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and
That's not
That's good. Thank you. Can't stop him. Thank you very much. Thanks. I hope you enjoy that. Anyway, to a more serious point, the reaction to inequity seems to have evolutionary advantages, because the monkeys will switch partners where the relationship is disadvantageous. And it's the same with the impunity game. Short term, but in the long term, it means that you're cooperating with partners who are fair. So that's really the explanation, or partly the explanation. It's not a self-conscious reaction, and I think we need to stress that. But it's a recognition of a social partner, and that's required. And it seems to be that that recognition of a social partner is extremely widespread. It goes right back to the invertebrates, would you believe? So it's really fascinating biologically to think that recognition of a social partner is really all that's required for that. And then, it's not just simply found in other monkeys, although the experiments haven't necessarily been done with those other beings. And I'm going to move on to some work by Sarah Brosnan, who you saw in that clip. She worked originally as a postdoc with Frans de Waal, but she's become a very eminent primatologist and psychologist in her own right. And she decided to test some of the theories a little bit more and find out whether there really was an evolutionary link between cooperation and inequity aversion. And she said, what she thought was that there would be you could predict three things, and they're on the slide here. First of all, inequity outcomes affect cooperation. Secondly, that negative responses to inequity would form in the context of cooperation. And thirdly, that cooperative species are more sensitive to inequity compared to less cooperative species. And she tested the first one, that is, inequity outcomes affect cooperation, using capuchin monkeys who were not in adjoining cages like the experiment you saw, but they needed to use an apparatus in a complex way in order for each of them to gain a reward. So they both sort of manipulated the apparatus in different ways, and then they both gained a reward. If they gained similar rewards by cooperating in this way, then the cooperation was sustained for many hours. If, on the other hand, one gained more, if they gained a better reward, such as the grape, for example, then the cooperation fell by about a third, even though the other partner would get a reward as well, but it would be a lesser reward. Secondly, negative responses to inequity in the context of cooperation. She tested this in relation to awareness of intention. So if someone dropped a grape deliberately, and the monkeys were aware of that, then there was more of a reaction to that than if it was just a chance event. And so it seems that they can tell the difference between something that is random and something that's deliberate. So a deliberate sort of refusal to give a reward was not tolerated, whereas one that was sort of by an accident was tolerated. And it's true of both humans and primates. There's a similar reaction. Where someone else has been where an individual monkey has been prevented from gaining a reward, or say they were prevented from gaining food access by another partner, then in future experiments, they also refuse to give their partner access to that food. So there's a kind of tit-for-tat process there. They also are very negative in their reaction to inequity, where the individual concerned previously stole food from them. So it's quite, what I'm trying to say is that it's quite complex social relationships of memory of what their partner has previously done, which I think is absolutely astonishing. And this also requires a task. And it seems that task, in some sense, mimics joint activity. And then in order to answer the third question, that is, cooperative species are more sensitive to inequity, this required a measurement of inequity aversion across many different species, so not just doing capuchin monkeys or others, but also comparing it with the lab and the field, so going out into the field and measuring what happens through observations. And it seems that what they found was that in the case of tamarins, there seems to be an exception. So tamarins are cooperative breeders between male and female, so they both rear their young, male and female tamarins. But they're insensitive to inequity aversion when they are in a partnership of male and female. And it seems that in this case, the explanation is that partnership is so important, they will tolerate a measure of inequity for the sake of cooperative breeding. We're now going to, and it's also as well important to point out that children will recognize lack of fairness as well, so from a very early age, from the time when they're still babies and they're not able to talk. So they can recognize, anyone who's had children of their own will, I think, cue into that. I'm now going to turn to a very different kind of study, and that's Mark Beckhoff, who's an ethologist who's worked for years with canids in the wild and in field experiments. And he partnered with a philosopher called Jessica Pierce to write a book that he named Wild Justice. And what's interesting in his particular study is that he argues for justice or fairness based on the social rules of fair play. So he looked at play behaviour of other animals, particularly canids. And he says that in this case, fairness is not just the good of the other, but it's the good of all, including the most vulnerable. And so it lacks the deliberation then of other forms of justice making. And he argues for a justice cluster based on, again, he's using anthropomorphic language in this case, based on cognitive ethology, a method where he studies or thinks about the particular mind of the creatures that he's observing. And his evidence for wild justice is on the basis of, first, fair play is good for all parties. Secondly, justice as fairness is universal. Thirdly, even babies have a sense of fairness. And fourthly, direct observations from animal behaviour. What's interesting is that even where there are even where one partner is different in age or different in size, the stronger of the partnership gives handicaps. In other words, they reduce their own advantage. Anyone who has dogs, we have a very playful red fox Labrador who will play with absolutely anything, from a little tiny dog right through to a giant Alsatian. But when you watch them play, they will adapt in order that the play is fair. So one could easily dominate the other, but the idea is that the social play and the social skills that develop have a way of cementing bonds, and it goes back, again, rather like inequity aversion, some of the other experiments I talked about, it goes back millions of years. The ability to play goes back right back to crustaceans. They found some kind of play behaviour in those. And also, I'll just do a couple of quotes from from Mark Bekoff. He says this: during social play, individuals can learn a sense of what's right and wrong, what's acceptable to others, the results of which is the development and maintenance of a social group or game that operates efficiently. So he still uses scientific language, but the idea is that he explains it through thinking about the rules for play behaviour and rules which are quite specific and concrete. I'm just going to take this off, I'm rather roasted. Excuse me. It doesn't matter with the video. But I'm now going to return just very briefly to some of Sarah Brosnan's work as a way of comparison, because one of the areas that she talks about is something called second-order inequity aversion, which is slightly more complex than the first-order inequity aversion that you saw on the video. This is a reaction when a partner receives less. So in other words, if I watch another partner receiving less than me, I react and refuse to accept the higher reward. It's a sensitivity to having too much. And I think this is absolutely fascinating, because you'd think that you wouldn't really expect, well, I wouldn't have expected primates or other animals to be able to do that or to think about that. So they refuse the higher reward if a partner receives less. And this is what Brosnan suggests as an explanation. She says that the results cannot ascertain the underlying motivations for this behaviour. Chimpanzees' responses may have been due to pro-social motivations, but may also have resulted from concern over accepting a higher level or higher value reward in the presence of a conspecific, e.g. potential retaliation. So in other words, she's cautioning about thinking that these are somehow good. There's goodness involved there. They might just be frightened of those who are potential partners and could retaliate. I think this shows really to me that the interpretation of observations can be done in different ways. Mark Bekoff would be far more likely to use anthropocentric, or anthropomorphic rather, language in order to explain the behaviour of the canids, that is, wolves and dogs and so on, that he observes. Whereas Sarah Brosnan is far more reticent to use that language and cautions against coming to too quick conclusions. The point is that we don't really know. So which one we choose may also depend on our own presuppositions about how far we're prepared to give other animals particular tendencies for good or ill, and so on. In any case, I think it's fair to say that second-order inequity aversion requires some kind of objective sense of fairness, whereas the first-order inequity aversion is a simple comparative measure. I have got less than you, and therefore I will react. So it's harder to explain second-order inequity aversion in the way that Sarah Brosnan does. It's still a speculation. In any case, one of the reasons for second-order inequity aversion is likely to be related to long-term cooperation. If I do good to my partner, even when they're receiving less, then it's more likely to be favourable in the long run. Even though Sarah Brosnan and Frans de Waal are fairly cautious about some things, they are well invested in what I would call a strong continuity thesis. So they say this: the pressure for increased cooperation combined with advanced cognitive abilities allowed humans to evolve a complete sense of fairness. So they're prepared to see it as a continuum rather than any kind of break. Having said that, they also, in other publications, are quite reluctant about using the language of fairness or justice. And sometimes I think their language of fairness elides into what I will call justice, whereas Mark Beckhoff is far more comfortable with using the language of justice, and he justifies it on the basis that it's a heuristic tool in order to understand the lives of other animals, because we can't avoid the fact that we have to use anthropomorphic language, but we can still be self-consciously using that language in order to try and understand the lives of other animals. Now we're coming to more theological reflections on this topic. So what does justice require theologically, having looked at some of the results of evolutionary anthropologists and ethologists? Is justice simply given by divine fiat? My own view is that justice does build on natural tendencies in other animals, including fair play and inequity aversion, but it doesn't collapse into one and the same thing. So in other words, there are distinctions about justice in the human sphere which make it different from that in other animals, but that's not to say that there isn't any kind of continuity. The social sciences then are illuminating for how we understand what it means to live justly and fairly in our societies. Aquinas believed that there was distributive justice as well as individual justice, that is, justice in relation to the state. And something like that hasn't been discussed in other animals, in other primates. Humans have a far more complex social organization. For Aquinas, justice also requires the freedom of the will. That is, it's a deliberative sense of acting in accordance with what is right and the good. At the same time, he was quite remarkable in the way he allowed for at least a kind of justice in other animals. And he says this, and I'll just see if I can find the quote. And so the right, jus, that is called natural in the first sense, is common to us and to the other animals. So he allowed for some kind of justice in other creatures, even though subsequently in the history of thought, that ability was denied by others. They became machines or automata. Aquinas was more, at least, conscious of that, possibly because he was influenced by Albert the Great, who wrote a Summa Zoologica, and almost all of that particular book was on other animals. There was only a relatively small section on humans, and he was Aquinas' teacher. At the same time, the alignment of the will to the good of others is distinctive, even though we observe something like that in second-order inequity aversion. Cooperation as such can be for good or evil ends, and so it's not really explained necessarily in the evolutionary literature why justice is preferred for non-kin. Excuse me. A missing element in this discussion so far, and one that I pointed out at the beginning of this talk, was that human morality, and I'll say it again, evolved in multi-species communities. It took thousands of years of co-evolution for humans to develop their moral systems. So inequity aversion, second order particularly, and justice are in some ways comparable, but they're not necessarily the same. So what a particular species or a collective species will develop will be different from that in humans, but they are intersecting in a very complex and interesting way. I think we need to move towards a holistic approach to what justice and fairness is also about. and think about what justice and fairness might be in a multi-species complex. It's become even more important now in the context of climate change to think about our own justice making, not just for ourselves, but for the millions of other species that are going extinct. Ethnoprimatology, ethnoelephantology, and ethnohyenology, these are all anthropological studies of complex human other animal relationships. So what anthropologists are starting to do, and one in particular, Agustin Fuentes, who I work with extensively, was to try and study things in their systems, in a relationship to one another. And that interspecies memory, I would say, has been lost in the Western world, apart from occasional understanding that we get in a limited way through knowledge of our pets. But that understanding of justice and the meaning of what it means came through struggle and negotiation with these other beings with whom we co-evolved. And I'm going to leave it now, that part now, to come to the second part of my talk, which is on deception and lying. Because again, I think it's easy to get too romantic, perhaps, about what other animals are capable of, and we need to balance that by thinking about other aspects which have led to less favourable aspects of our human morality. So Robert Mitchell has argued for different levels of deception in the animal world, going from basic mimicry of another animal right through to behavioural changes. Snakes will feign death, for example, in order to avoid capture. And fireflies will mimic reproductive displays of other species in order to attract or be a camouflage. In order to attract another species and then trap them. Camouflage doesn't count, according to Robert Mitchell. So I put on that slide, you can see camouflage, where he's saying that that's not true deception. But much more generally, deception will only work if there's an overall system of what biologists call, using anthropomorphic language, honest signaling. So what they say is that without this broader acceptance of honesty, if you like, in behaviours between creatures, then deception wouldn't be possible, because otherwise no one would trust anybody. That is, in putting it in anthropomorphic terms. Mimicry is also an interesting one, because there are false alarm calls by birds and other beings, often when they are feeding. So if a particular bird is not dominant and they alarm call, then they will also get access to that food. But the point is that if they didn't believe them, they could be dead. So the idea is that even though that's a false alarm, it's better in general to believe it. Otherwise, if you don't, that could be the end of your life. So that's, again, another reason perhaps why, at least in limited cases, false alarms work. In an experiment with Capuchin monkeys, Donna Keene has found that an emotional state is necessary for false alarm calls to be raised, and the precondition seems to be anxiety. But it's not always sufficient to lead to that particular false alarm. So she's done some sort of psychological studies on what happens when false alarms are given by monkeys. And so the question we need to ask ourselves, and I hope you can see that writing, is, are human lies just simply exaggerated forms of deception, or is it something else? And I think it's rather like the question about justice or morality. Is there a continuum or is there not? Certainly the psychological and evolutionary accounts of human deception will describe it as a natural phenomena. So they're not putting any value judgments on it. So not then refusing to say whether it's unethical or whether it's right or wrong, and it's seen as a psychological adaptation which can be for socially approved goals or other goals. But lying in general is again explained in various ways. First of all, it may be because of fear of discovery, of misdeeds. So lying can take place because of that fear. Secondly, it can be because of a sense of threat, either because the partner is dominant, or there's envy or greed involved. And we all know instances of why people lie in our relationships, I'm sure. But sometimes lying could be to protect the vulnerable other. So to protect a baby, we might lie in order to make sure, for whatever reason. Self-aware lying, on the other hand, well, not on the other hand, in addition to this, may be of three types. And the first one, which is covering up a misdeed to avoid punishment, appears as young as 2 years of age. So 2-year-old children can have self-aware forms of lying to cover up misdeeds. It may be an attempt to gain advantages, such as cheating, and again, that's mostly in school children. The exaggeration to gain attention is found in up to 3 years of age. And self-illusory forms of deception, where individuals have deceived themselves, has been found in children as young as 7. And in this kind of self-illusory one, it might be something like they were, when they buried their dead animal, they thought that they were going to suffocate. That's a kind of form of self-illusory deception. So what about theology in this case? Well, what's interesting is that Jesse Deane-Drummond, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right, he's used some of this literature to argue that it gives empirical plausibility for original sin. At the same time, he says, we are still responsible, and we should not be too ready to excuse ourselves. But I'm not quite as convinced as he might be, because I think the natural tendency for self-deception is a culturally evolved capacity. Even though it's found in babies, it's still, at least forms of deception, that is, it's still culturally informed. Whereas Augustine's theory of original sin was that it was distributed through the semen, through sex. So he associated sex with all the negative things that we already know about Augustine. But at the same time, he tried to do a biological explanation, whereas these explanations are slightly different. They're not directly related to our genetics. They are more learnt culturally in evolutionary terms, and I think it's slightly different. So I'm not sure that evolutionary psychology gives a plausibility for original sin in the way that Jesse Deane-Drummond does. I think it's an interesting idea to think about, and I also think that Augustine stressed the priority of grace over original sin. And if I was going to talk about the evolution of grace, that would be a completely different lecture. But I think it's interesting to see that his Augustine's absolute stance against all lies is also extremely different from the evolutionary psychology's acceptance of lies as something quite normal and natural and therefore to be explained. So I'm not as convinced as he is that it sort of allies with original sin. You may have your own views on that. I also am not necessarily convinced that those explanations from evolutionary psychology are sufficient to account for lying in all of its different dimensions. Rowan Williams believes that natural science is insufficient to account for transcendental forms of language more generally. And he argues that lying is different from reception because lying is a kind of falsity where an agent bears false witness. So it's a different kind of, it's not as simple as just another form of deception. Could lying ever be language-free? Theoretically, it's possible, according to Rowan Williams, although he doesn't discuss that. Also, generally speaking, philosophers will say that lying relies on deliberate use of language in order to deceive another. The philosophy of lying has its own literature as well. No, it's coming. It takes a while to come up. And the intention is also important. There are two broad philosophical traditions. One from Aristotle, where lying is permissible, depending on consequences. So the intention is important. He rejected lying if it was related to boasting or false humility, but he allows for it if it came from some kind of excellence. In other words, if we were trying to help someone else and save their life, then we could lie and justify that. On the other hand, Immanuel Kant, as you might expect, knowing what he said about other things, he said that lying is never permissible under any circumstances. And Augustine and Aquinas follow these two. So Augustine followed lying is never permissible, the Kantian tradition, and Aquinas followed the Aristotelian tradition that lying may be permissible depending on circumstances. So here are a couple of citations from Augustine and Aquinas, just to illustrate the point. So Augustine, again, believed that the lie was a deliberate act of duplicity, or the double heart, as he called it in some cases. And he uses sexist language, but he was referring to both men and women, I should say. This is just from a 1887 text. That man lies who has one thing in his mind and utters another in words, or by signs of whatever kind, whence also the heart of him who lies is said to be double. That is, there is a double thought, the one of that thing which he either knows or thinks to be true and does not produce, the other of that thing which he produces instead thereof, knowing or thinking it to be false. That idea of a double heart is important for him. And Aquinas follows Augustine to some degree, but then he's in tension with, is also influenced by Aristotle. So he says this: just as this is contrary to truth to signify something with words differently than what one has in one's mind, it is also contrary to truth to use signs or deeds or things to signify the opposite of what is in oneself. And this is properly called dissimulation. Thus, dissimulation is properly a lie told through the signification of outward deeds. So for Aquinas, a lie was saying something false and deceiving, but at the same time, it was a sin against the truth. And it's interesting to think that biologists also use this language of honest signalling. So their language is replete with human metaphors for the behaviour of other animals, while recognizing that there are still distinctions. Humans can and do have abstract ideas, and the ability to deceive is much more complicated, and the perfection of the lie is that ability to deceive. But a lie that does not deceive is still a lie, whereas it doesn't make any sense biologically to say that deception can be there if it fails. So I think that sort of highlights the difference between them. You can lie even when it doesn't work, as it were, but you can't deceive biologically if it's not working. For Aquinas, moderate forms of lying is permissible, but it depends on the motivation and what the intention is, and it depends therefore on whether it's a mortal or a venial sin, as he called it. A mortal sin is where it refers to God or is opposed to love in any way, or it deliberately harms an individual, or it incites scandal, or anything that turns away from what he calls the last end. On the other hand, when it's not turning away from God, or not doing the other things that I've just mentioned, then it's a venial sin. So when the intent is love, then it is permissible, but it's still not right, but it's permissible. So he understands then lies as sins against the truth. So he resists a kind of a reductionist interpretation, but he moderates the Augustine's position and refuses, while at the same time refusing to name any lie as good. Now, certainly in this post-truth society, it's important, I think, for theologians and others to think about lying and deception. And so he takes account then of the complexity of moral decision-making, rather than saying necessarily that one is absolutely right and one is absolutely wrong. And now I'm coming to my final slide, so thank you for your patience. Whoops, here we are. So I called this talk, We See in a Glass Darkly, Exploring the Hermeneutics of Virtue and Vice Beyond the Species Boundary. And I'm going to read this last section to make sure I get it right. So the premise for this title is that there are always limitations to our understanding. But exploring the boundary between humans and other animals in the explicit area of morality and the specific virtues and vices in particular is illuminating, not just for enabling a deeper understanding of both animals and humans, but also for the engagement between science and religion. I've skated on the surface of different dimensions that are possible in this area of dialogue, but tried to illustrate the points by reference to what's arguably one of the most universal moral norms across cultures, justice, and a universal immoral norm, lying. I could have discussed contemporary trends towards post-truth, which works against both science and morality, but that would be another talk altogether. Justice and lying, I suggest, draw on tendencies found in other animals and go deep into our evolutionary history, even going as far back as crustaceans, if we believe those who talk about fair play, especially if we associate complex and explicit abilities such as self-deception or lying. Sorry, I missed a line here. Especially if we associate justice with fair play. At the same time, human morality becomes considerably more complex, and explicit abilities such as self-deception or lying are unique to humankind. Rather than seeing such negative tendencies as support for the idea of original sin, I prefer to understand this as part of helping explain the origin of sin. Drawing together both scientific and classical Christian thinking means that self-conscious decisions need to be made about what morality means. It's partly illuminated by psychology and evolutionary science, but never can be reduced to it. Otherwise, we arrive at a debunking of morality and religion on the basis that moral or religious truth, or even justice-making, are convenient social norms simply to aid cooperation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Celia, for, a fascinating talk on animal ethology with some really astonishing material. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. We have about 20 minutes for questions, and I will do the roving mic with this big thing. Who would like to open, please? Chris, looks like you're first.
Thank you very much, Celia. It's such a rich area. And I just wanted to ask you to tease out the concept of sin. Is that something you'd want to reserve for the human being, or do we see sin or proto-sin in other species? Can you help us to puzzle that out?
Okay. Thank you very much for that question. I mean, I have written about this before. My sense is that it depends how we define sin. So I'm sorry to avoid the question. But if we define it as a deliberate turning away from God, then it doesn't necessarily make sense to talk about it for other animals. Although I know some people working in this area think that other animals have a close relationship with God and directly relate to them in that way. I'm a bit more cautious about that. But if we define sin as some more general capacity for ill, then I would say it does reach back into the other animal world. And we need to recognize that. But at the same time, we have to balance that by not stressing that so much that we think that our morality is some kind of add-on to our basic brutish sinful nature, of which we get from animals. So I want to avoid that. At the same time, recognize that what I see is as the realism, as we talked about it in Bhaskara's mini talk earlier this afternoon, is that it's very complex. And so we don't fully understand where these tendencies come from, but it becomes far more sophisticated and complex in human societies. And just as we have intimations of sinful, and in brackets, behaviour in other animals, it becomes far more sophisticated and deliberative in human societies. And therefore, but that doesn't mean that both humans and other animals aren't in some way redeemed and potentially even reconciled. So I would say that I'm prepared to use that language of sin, but only if I explain what I mean first, to avoid any possible confusions.
Finn, do we have an online question?
Thank you. The question is, there is a popular idea that some false statements are only lying if the listener needs to know and or is entitled to the truth. What do you think about that? Just a little one,
I think that I would follow Aquinas on that and say that lying is always a sin. But it may be that in some cases it can be justified by the greater good. But in the case that has just been mentioned, it sounds like that's not necessarily the greater good. So I would have to know the full context of what was being asked about to know whether that lying would actually benefit that individual for their overall good or not, or whether it was just a sort of post-truth understanding, which almost minimizes the importance of truth and lying. So the problem I have with the post-truth society is that it seems to minimize the value of it and diminish it. I think that's the deeper sin, if you like, is it's refusing to recognize it as being wrong.
Thanks. I was just wondering whether deception is effectively ubiquitous, omnipresent, in that we're always deceived about another creature. We don't know the full information about that creature. If we did, we would be kind of merged and we would be potentially able to consume, abuse all other creatures. So there's an automatic barrier, there's an automatic deception, whether it's intentional or not. And therefore, I'm thinking, is the concept of deception and truthfulness really so binary? Is there not an automatic continuity? And this also plays into the idea of being economical with the truth. When does one have to really reveal everything? I was also interested as to why the scholar thought that the moth was not deceiving. That's a separate question.
Yeah, okay. So I think in relation to our other animals and not understanding fully, I don't see that as deception. I just see that as lack of knowledge. So it's an epistemic ignorance rather than a deception. So it's not even self-deception. We might be self-deceived by assuming certain things about other animals which aren't really there. But I think that kind of self-deception is an honest one. So in that sense, I would agree that there is a little bit of blurring in that sense. So it may be that there are, in the history of science, there are plenty of occasions where scientists have got it wrong and then found later that they were wrong and admitted to it. But the seeking is towards the truth and trying to find what really is the case rather than accepting that lack of knowledge is sufficient. So there's always that inquiry going on. So while that inquiry goes on, I think a measure of self-deception can be tolerated and even accepted. So in that sense, I agree with that, in that contextual situation of a slight blurring of those boundaries. But that's why I called this talk "We See in a Glass Darkly," because that context of that particular phrase comes from a Pauline discussion of love. And I think if our intention is one of love and affirmation of other creatures, and we are there seeking their own benefit as well as our own, then that kind of reluctance of knowing whatever can be tolerated. And we just, I think it also depends on our own social and political presuppositions as well. I know that I talked to an interesting Jewish philosopher and ethicist at a conference in Hamburg a few weeks ago, and he thought, when I gave an element of something similar on that particular piece, he thought that Franz de Waal has his own particular position on animal rights and things, whereas Mark Beckhoff is much more in favour, and therefore that partly shapes the way they present their material. Are they being self-deceived, or are they trying to seek it according to their own lights and truths? It's very hard to know that, but you have to sort of qualify what they're saying, knowing their own particular political and other stance. So it's always going to a degree, shape who we are and what we say. My own particular view is probably shaped by the fact that I've been a biologist as well, and I'm fascinated with the biological studies, even if I'm not accepting them fully. And that's the skepticism that most biologists are trained to, not to believe everything necessarily. You want to test it through experiment. We're living in the boundary all the time, but we have to at least try and be self-aware of what that boundary is.
Thank you for your presentation. So in one of your slides, you outlined that the humans require freedom of the will for justice. And so you correlate very well with the Thomistic kind of understanding. But from the rest of the presentation, I have the impression that there is a kind of continuity between the non-human and the human. There is not such a clear divide between rational and non-rational, right? So my question is, so that sentence, so the fact that humans require freedom of the will, are you implying that non-human beings don't have the freedom of the will, or do they have it? Is it different? Because it's critical for understanding the embryonic form of morality within the non-human beings. So I would like to know what you think.
Thank you very much for that question. Maybe I should clarify. When I was talking about the freedom of the will, I was talking about Aquinas' position and the distinctive aspects of human justice making. But that doesn't mean that there aren't versions or forms of justice in other animals, but it depends on how you define what that justice is. Or I would probably be a little bit reluctant to call those forms of justice in other animals in the way that Mark Beckhoff is. If you want me to put my cards on the table, I would call it fairness rather than justice. So I would prefer to say wild fairness rather than his wild justice, simply because I don't think we can really call it justice. But again, it depends partly on how you define what that justice is. I also think that even Aquinas believed that there was a form of fairness in other animals as well. So he had this dialectic between fairness and justice, and the two are connected to one another. One is, if you like, a prerequisite for the other, but they're not the same. So fairness is a prerequisite for justice, and inequity aversion is a prerequisite for fairness. And so they build on one another like a nested egg. So I think that that's where I would position myself. So there's some measure of continuity and discontinuity, rather like seeing that other animals have souls and the human soul is also nested within that, and the vegetative soul and so on. So there's a continuity and discontinuity both at the same time. So, and I think the trying to work out that puzzle is extremely complicated. But we also know that there are distinctive aspects of the human community and our ability to make and form justice, which is very, very different from other creatures. But that doesn't mean to say we're cut off from them. There is this continuity. So understanding forms of fairness, or whatever you want to call it, in other creatures helps us to understand, if you like, our most deeply rooted tendencies, very often which are affective rather than necessarily rational. So fairness is an affective tendency in a way that justice is more detached. So the two sort of work in concert rather than in conflict with one another, or should in the moral life. So.
Thank you very much, Celia. I enjoyed your talk, many interesting points. I wonder whether we can perhaps explore your very first statement about Immanuel Kant. You brushed away Immanuel Kant rather abruptly at the beginning.
Yes.
So perhaps we can return to him, because according to him, an act is moral if and only if the agent conceives it as satisfying or not satisfying a rule that the agent sets himself or herself as a rule. So there is a lot of conceptualizing in it. Mm-hmm. If we don't accept that position for humans, it means that the act will be impulsive, automatic, or accidental. And we immediately realize how fundamental this point is, even in our legal system. No? Whether you, homicide and murder, for instance, I mean, very important distinctions that characterize our way of organizing our lives as humans. So I think it has also some kind of reflection if we want to extend our moral reflections towards non-human animals, because we may, in fact, if we continue on the Kantian position, consider all kinds of morally significant actions on parts of non-human animals as impulsive, automatic, because there is no depth of conception in there as we would expect in a human being. What's your position on this point?
Yeah, I mean, I do know one Kantian philosopher who's argued that Kant can also be used to support animal rights. It's not impossible to draw on Kantian thinking in a sophisticated way in detail and make it work. But I put him there as a plumb line, really, of the range. And the reason why I mentioned him at all was because some definitions of morality become so narrow, it then becomes impossible to even think about the evolution of morality. So in the particular context of legal strife or decision-making in the courts and so on, a Kantian understanding may be helpful, but that's a different kind of question from, what are the evolutionary roots of morality? And I think it takes a lot of hard work, philosophical work, to allow Kant to be used in that mode. It may be possible, and I'm not a Kantian specialist, but I do know a Kantian philosopher that has drawn on his work in order to argue for animal rights. So I don't think it's impossible, but it's harder. So he was more of a plumb line rather than a rejection. It was saying this is the one end of the scale, and the other end of the scale is the evolutionary explanations, which, again, like you say, don't seem to have any norms at all. But on the other hand, I would question the idea that all animals just simply operate out of instinct in the way you hinted at, because in some cases it's been found that there is a sense of double intention within other animals. In other words, there is a level of recognizing the other as other in a sophisticated way, especially in second-order inequity aversion. So it's a little bit more complicated than saying that animals operate out of instinct and out of impulse. It's far more complicated than that because they do have a measure of cognitive abilities that are far beyond what we originally thought. And I also perhaps should add that there's been a discovery in the last few years of something called Homo naledi, which is a hominin that has a very tiny brain the size of Australopithecus. And they found that that creature with this tiny, tiny brain was quite capable of burying their dead in very sophisticated caves. So the reason I'm mentioning that is that we have this linear view of, here are other beings with a small cognitive ability, and then gradually become more and more sophisticated till we get to the humans who are capable of this abstract reasoning. But actually there were humans around that were capable of quite sophisticated actions that had tiny, tiny brains, and they can't really explain that. It seems to go against the theory of mind. And that, I think, is actually really, really interesting. Because if our theory of mind is wrong, that means that the categorization of humans are these sophisticated beings that are capable of theory of mind, whereas animals are not, and therefore they can't do X, Y, and Z, is wrong. So I'd say that, good point to raise. I'm not a Kantian philosopher. I would ask someone who is to explore it a little bit further and make it a bit more sophisticated. So thank you.
An online question now.
We've got two online, but I'll start with the one who someone hasn't asked a question yet. This says, has there been any work done exploring the evolution of morality in cross-species contexts, as well as in the same species context that you looked at in this? I know that there's been some studies using ethnoprimatology, for example, and using tools to study the interactions between humans and other animals and how they behave towards one another. But specifically examining different elements of morality, I'm not aware of that. So it may well be that it's been done, but I haven't found it yet, because my own instinct is that that would be the way forward and another question that would be worth exploring. Thank you. And then the second one is, would some trauma responses be considered as self-deception, do you think, such as the brain blocking out a traumatic event? Could you class something like that as self-deception?
Oh dear, we need a psychologist to bring to help with that one. I have to admit ignorance on that, I think. I think that in that sense it's probably a valuable self-deception, if it is a self-deception, because it's protecting the mind from too much negativity until such time as that individual can face it. So I would say that that may be an evolved advantage of self-deception, that we do have these abilities to block things off.
One last question before we break.
Hello. What are your thoughts about the role of language? Because animals don't have a true language, or at least they might have some features of language in their communication. And how might the difference between humans and animals in language, what does that imply for differences in how justice emerges, for example?
Sorry, I missed that last piece.
The fact that animals don't have language and humans do,
yes.
What does that imply for the kinds of justice that might be different between humans and animals?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I talked about lying, and as obviously one language-based and the deception not being language-based. I think when it comes to justice, again, it has to do with our ability to abstract. But even in, early hominin communities that were incapable of language, there were forms of morality there that were functional. So I would say that language gives a measure of sophistication to justice making, but is not necessarily an absolute requirement for it. I think I'd be hesitant to suggest that. But the actual, the evolution of justice or morality and the specific forms of it, that would take a lot more work to actually work out when it arose in relation to language, and it would be very difficult to do because you're dealing with extant humans. So how do you, I know some very good work by Penny Spikins, who's looked at the evolution of compassion, and she's found evidence for compassion in very early hominin communities, including Neanderthals, who have kept alive those with extreme disabilities in a way you would think would be non-evolutionary advantageous. But it's much more, so you can track that from looking at the bones, because you can say they had various diseases and so on. It's much more difficult to track the evolution of justice making. It'd be very hard to work out, you know, in evolutionary terms, whether it coincided with language or not. But it's a good question, but I'm not sure how to answer it. Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for your questions. We now have a 15-minute break, and we come back at past for the first of the Peacock Prize sessions. But please let's thank Celia for a fantastic opening plenary.